Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Goldstein. I serve as the director for the Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center, which is a partnership consortium based at the University of Alaska Southeast. We grew from a memorandum of understanding signed in 2009 to this point today, where the partnership network is 16 institutions, 16 organizations strong. If you're not yet a member and you'd like to be, please come talk to myself or anyone on the ACRC coordinating committee. We also have a developing affiliate scientist program where we have collaborative work with several of you who have come to join us to give talks about your specialties. The Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center, based at UAS, I am so thankful for everybody who has participated in the work. I specifically want to acknowledge 3 members of the ACRC staff, Brad Ewing, Heather Bennett, and Brittany Lenhart, who have worked especially hard to bring this all together, and they've touched many of you along the way, I think. So. There's also a few people who worked especially hard on the early design of the program. John Lawrence from P&W, Sanjay Piari from UAS, Wayne Owen from the Alaska region of the Forest Service, Leilani Knight McQueen from Central Council, and many others, but just a few people to name in the short order. The sponsors of our Rainforest Center Symposium include University of Alaska Southeast, the U.S. Forest Service, many units of the U.S. Forest Service, from the Pacific Northwest Research Station to the Tongass to the Alaska region, and the many benefits that have come to us from the Chugach National Forest. The North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Alaska region, particularly the Juneau Field Office, and the support we've received here from our chair, Bill Hansen. Thank you, Bill. The USGS Alaska area, and special thanks to Carl Markon and Mark Shasby in the early days, and Lyman Thorstensen, who spent quite a bit of time with us helping really elaborate on our strategic plan that we published a month or 2 ago. The Juneau Economic Development Council, as many of you seen, especially helped us with symposium registrations. And the Nature Conservancy, who have done quite a bit working with us, not only in helping bring Peter Kareiva for our talks tonight and Thursday, but with many of the other aspects of the research development for the Rainforest Center. And lastly, I would be remiss if I did not thank my bosses, Paul Brewster at the Forest Service and Rick Caulfield, Provost at UAS. So with that, I'd like to introduce Chancellor John Pugh, who was appointed in 1999 to University of Alaska Southeast, the Chancellor's position. John came to the university after a 15-year career with the state of Alaska, the Department of Health and Social Services, serving as commissioner of that department from 1983 to 1986. John is strongly committed to community service, presently serves as the president of the Gastineau Rotary Club and vice chair of the board of directors for the Juneau Economic Development Council. John was instrumental in many ways in building the foundation of the Rainforest Center and providing a home for it at UAS. Please help me warmly welcome Chancellor Pugh.
Well, it's good to see all of you out here tonight. How many of you got to go to Berners Bay today? Woo, all right. I heard that we had 132 participants, and what a day that was. Beautiful day. We saw the whales, we saw lots of sea lions, birds, and just a beautiful weather and flat seas, which we all really enjoyed. So particularly, I'm sure all of you folks from outside really enjoyed that. So great start to the symposium. I wanted to do a welcome, and just to give you a little bit, I've been very impressed as we've started to register folks about how many people from around the state of Alaska have registered for this symposium, but also from the Northwest, as well as from other parts of the country and Canada. For tomorrow, we're going to have 208 registered, and the next day 206. 40% of the registrants from academic institutions, 27% from federal, state, and local agencies, 21% from First Nations and NGOs, 13% from businesses, and of that, as I said earlier, from all over, but 76% from Alaska. It's a good representation, a good start, and shows some great support for what we're trying to do here at the Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center. This activity was very interesting. I know, many years ago, and Mayor Bruce Botello is here tonight. Mayor Bruce Botello is one of the sort of founding folks on the center, kept coming and talking to me about what can we do to develop research for the Tongass, and he was very active in the Tongass Roundtable, and of course this brought some ideas about couldn't we have a research center at the university here that really could work on issues in the Tongass. And so from the very beginning, this activity of the symposium was envisioned because we thought this would be a way to get the word out, but not only that, to share ideas and to really begin to be able to achieve the vision and the goals of the center. Originally, we thought we were going to be last year and having this, and we didn't quite make it, but I tell you what, I'm pleased that we made it this year, and I think it's even much better than it would have been had we moved forward last year. So, Mike, thanks a lot. It really has been great. And Mike already did a lot of the thank yous. Michael did thank the staff, and I too want to thank our staff. What a great job they did. But I want to thank Michael Goldstein. What a job he's done in the leadership and commitment to the goals of the Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center. I want to congratulate you. This really is sort of the crown on doing the last couple of years of work. So if we'll give Michael a real hand in this. I also, as I said, want to thank some of the founding folks. Mayor Botello is here, and the Forest Service folks. From the very beginning, we've had a long relationship with the Forest Service at UAS. I mentioned today when I first came aboard in 1987, one of the first things I was dealing with was the Forest Service lab. Now, I guess you don't want to follow my footsteps because 25 years later it's finally being built. Took us a long time, but this was the third iteration of that lab that I've worked on over those 25 years. But again, I think it shows that close relationship of the U.S. Forest Service and the University of Alaska, and particularly University of Alaska Southeast. And I want to thank all of the Forest Service folks, Paul Brewster, Bo Eve, who's here from the lab region, Beth Pendleton, who's here. I saw her out there. They've just been extremely supportive about getting this center up and running and starting. And of course, they loaned Michael to us for the last couple of years, and we couldn't have done it without that. So I want to thank them for their support. Little history just to give you a sense of this. We really started talking about this in 2005. I know Michael mentioned 2009, but the truth is we had an earlier version, and actually you were a part of that. I remember reviewing that early on in 2005 and 2006, and we started talking about an institute, research institute. Well, for those of you who are academics and in our system, you know that has a different meaning than center, and also it has a different level of review by presidents and boards and stuff. And after a year working on that, I said, let's forget that. Let's just have a center. We can control that. Then we don't have to go to the president and the board and all of that, and we can do what we want. No, it wasn't exactly like that, but there was a little bit of that in me after struggling for a year to get them to think about an institute, and we weren't getting very far. So we chose then to work towards having a research center here and begin to gather partners for this research center. And as I said, the Forest Service and the city and borough of Juneau were right there from the very beginning in terms of working with us. And then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came aboard and started working closely with us as well. And then University of Alaska Fairbanks was added quickly into that. And over the few years before we finally got our memorandum of agreement done, Some of the changes that took place, which I think are really important, is when we first started, we called it the Tongass Forest Research Center. And as we were talking with the Forest Service, working with them, there really was a push to, look, let's talk about the coastal rainforest, and that includes parts of the Chugach. So if we do that, it makes it a much tighter way of looking at things. It also broadens, in a way, our vision of what we're doing. We're not just dealing with the Tongass, we're dealing with coastal rainforest. And so that change was made, and finally in August of 2009, we were able to hammer out a memorandum of agreement with all of those folks, and we all signed that and move forward. And again, it's history. We hired Michael, and it was great to have that. Now, I wanted to do a couple of things on the initial purpose so you can see where we're headed, and also, since you're here, what we're trying to do at this symposium. In the initial document, we said what was the purpose, and it said to serve as a collaborative environment that expands and enhances education and research opportunities by coordinating activities among the cooperating agencies. And an additional goal was to develop ways to disseminate the resulting research information through all the suitable means, whether they were reports or, circulars, films, journals, magazine articles, and the internet, the web, and so on. So the idea was that we really needed to get together and start doing together research in the coastal rainforest, and also begin to disseminate that information. One of the things that we talked a lot about is the Forest Service Library at the time had been over at the old building, and we moved it to UAS and much more of a public place, with the idea that we could get more information out to the public, and again, just started to think of ways that we really can disseminate this. So it's not just a bunch of sort of us internally talking to one another, but we begin to get the public involved in talking and understanding what the issues are and where we're going. And some of when we come out with management recommendations or policy recommendations, there's a foundation for that in the public. They understand that what we're trying to do out here has some basis in science and in work that has been going on for a number of years. So we did that. That was sort of the initial purpose. We started working on a strategic plan, and I remember the draft plan. I was really impressed that right out of the box, we were able to say, all of us, to get together on a statement of what we were going to try to do. And it said the ACRC established in 2009 in recognition of the increasing vulnerability of Alaska's coastal rainforest to climate change and other environmental stressors. The ACRC supports science to address the potential effects of climate change through education and coordination. ACRC promotes integrated approaches to ecosystem science, support of natural resource management and conservation needs through cooperative research and monitoring. And this, I think, is the important one, and hopefully, I think Peter is going to be talking about this. Final sentence of that purpose statement in that draft strategic plan was, humans are an integral part of the rainforest community, and the ACRC encourages citizen interest, participation in its science, education, outreach activities. Today, we had a large contingent of the Alaska Native community from Juneau who are connected to the land and connected to the area that we visited in Berners Bay and so on. The idea being that we need to get all the folks who really have a sense of this place and are committed to this place at the table to really talk about what is it that we want this incredible, rainforest to be for us as a community in so many ways. And many of us have come late. I've been here 42 years. 10,000 years is a little different than 42, and I think having the folks who've been here 10,000 years at the table is really important, and I was really proud that that happened today. But I think we got to remember that all the communities that are in the Tongass and in the Chugach on the coastal region, they're a part of this, and we need to make sure that they're a part of our discussions and at the table. And again, as I say, to me, the most important thing is that we really are able to disseminate our science and what we're doing and really get them engaged in understanding that, because then we can move our agendas forward and we really can get some things done. As I said earlier, this symposium was one of the strategies to enable us to begin to accomplish our overall vision, our mission and goals for the center. And I want to say that your presence here this evening demonstrates your commitment to joining us in this endeavor. I want you to commit, so I'm saying you are committed. If you're here, you're committed. And if you haven't joined, as Michael said, get to the table. We're here for you to join, be a member of the organization. But first I just want to welcome you, and let's just get to work and get it done. And thanks for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chancellor. I think he might have been saying, put some skin in the game. So the Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center has grown and survived over this last couple of years. And as I was reading through our sponsor list, I jumped over someone, and I apologize greatly, because this organization has been there since the get-go, since before I was able to move over from the Forest Service for this 2-year stint. And Wilberforce Foundation has come to the table for the last 2 years, and we thank you also very much. I also want to let you know that if you weren't familiar with it, we are streaming live on our website, acrc.alaska.edu, and so when you get back to your hotels or to your homes tonight, please email all of your closest friends, and we will increase our audience, 2, 3, 4-fold, hopefully, across the region, and it will be broadcast on 360 North starting next week, and then video on demand. 360 North and KTOO have been great partners in this effort as well. I have the honor to introduce Dr. Peter Kareiva. Peter Kareiva is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, where he's responsible for developing and helping to implement science-based conservation throughout his organization and for forging new linkages with partners. Peter joined the Nature Conservancy staff in 2002 after more than 20 years in academia and with NOAA. Among his duties as chief scientist, he also has other current projects which emphasize the interplay of human land use and biodiversity, resilience in the face of global change, and marine conservation. Peter has authored over 100 scientific articles, and he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2007, and in 2011 was named a member of the National Academy of Sciences for his excellence in original scientific research. Peter co-founded with Gretchen Daly and Taylor Ricketts the Natural Capital Project, a pioneering ecosystem services partnership, and he'll talk about ecosystem services and corporate sustainability on Thursday night at our banquet. It should be a fine talk as well. Tonight, please help me welcome Dr. Peter Kareiva to speak to us about Alaska's place in the future of conservation.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here. I've never been to Juneau. I've been to Alaska quite a bit, and this is different. It has a different feel to it. It's really spectacular. I'm a little nervous about having this up on the web, and because that means I have to be careful in what I say, and I'm not good at that. So some of my ex-students, Amanda, you could catch me when I start to put my foot in my mouth. So what I want to do is what I like to do in an evening talk like this is have a conversation, create a conversation about Alaska's special role. And you all know that you're a special place. I think that's why a lot of people live here. I bet you most school kids at some point see a map like this, a map that compares Alaska to the lower 48 in a lot of different ways. And what I want to do is I'm going to reflect on where the conservation community is. I'm going to speak mainly to what's happening politically and in the agenda in the lower 48, and then contrast that with Alaska and contrast that with sort of the future for Alaska continuing to be a special place. And in the Beltway, inside the Beltway, where environmental groups, TNC, the Nature Conservancy, WWF, Environmental Defense Fund, lobbyists, industry, and so forth, all sort of congregate to influence federal policy, the environment's not doing too well. And this was an essay that was written many years ago now, but it got a lot of traction. It was about the death of environmentalism. It was mainly motivated by how the country addressed climate change, but it has other threads through it as well as just climate change. And if you're a conservationist and you're honest and you read this, even though you might have disagreed with a lot of it, parts of it rang true. One of my favorite quotes from this, incidentally, is the quote that if Martin Luther King had been an environmentalist, instead of giving the speech, "I have a dream," he would have given the speech, "I have a nightmare." And there's lots of data. I mean, there's tons of polls. The Nicholas School of Environment at Duke takes these polls. The Gallup takes these polls. The Yale School of Forestry and Environment takes polls. And they all show a trend where the environment is, nobody's against the environment. You could ask 100 people on the street and ask them, do you care about the environment? They all say yes. I mean, who's going to say it's like saying you don't like your mother. But when it comes to action, when it comes to priorities, when it comes to legislation, when it comes to policy and an investment, it's a different story. It doesn't really get that action. It doesn't really get the investment. This is a poll that tracks whether the environment should give it priority or economic growth ever. And in recent years, it's flip-flop. So it used to be the environment trumped economic growth, well over 50%, and now it's down to under 35% would say you would ever take the environment over economic growth. And then there's this other theme. I get in trouble because I've said this in talks and I've been beaten up on it, but I'm still going to stick with it. And there's a certain inauthenticity, if you will. And I want to contrast that to Alaska because I have been here several times, and I think there's a real authenticity to the conservation and the outdoor ethic in Alaska. But there's a certain inauthenticity in some of our iconic environmental and conservation thinkers. Henry David Thoreau. Many of us had to read him in college. This is a famous quote. Very much out Walden Pond, just the importance of wilderness. But what was Henry David Thoreau? His mother came on the weekends and did his laundry. That's not what I have in mind as sort of an authentic, man in the wild. My other one, and I get grief for picking on Edward Abbey. I read Edward Abbey he was in his 60s. I was a product of that generation. I loved it. It was radical. It was exciting. It was stimulating. Inauthentic. I show the atomic bomb here because when he talked about being out in Moab, in Utah, and he talked about the great pristine wilderness that he's in, he didn't mention that while I was there, he could see over 20 nuclear tests. He managed to keep that out of his depiction of that wilderness. And he wrote this whole book about desert solitaire where he celebrated being under the night lonely sky and being alone and how good it was to be alone in wilderness. And then here's what he wrote in his journal. And he said the book was taken from his journal, by the way. Christ, I am lonely. Oh, the long, lonesome hours dreaming of Rita. Why Hoboken should be closer on the moon. His wife went back to Hoboken in New Jersey with the kids, and he was lonely. Inauthentic. And what's that gotten us? There has been a constant battle where conservation is somehow seen in many settings as against parts of the public and the sector. The upper right-hand corner there is in California about keeping water for salmon, but not for irrigation for agriculture. There's, from my neck of the woods, the spotted owl. There's miners and so forth. But that's not a position to be in. You do not want to be promoting conservation and doing it in such a way that you could be boxed into a corner and saying you're anti-jobs, or my kid is not getting a meal because of you. That's not a position to be in. And so I would say that that death of environmentalism is partly because it's been easy to paint conservation, the environmental movement, and you can certainly see this in Congress and in the politics, as anti-growth, anti-technology, very sort of romantic and unwilling to face change, and just not rational. Maybe that's unfair, but nonetheless, that is a sentiment that is out there, and it damages our ability to get policies and investments that we need. Let's talk now. I'm going to start bringing in some Alaska and weaving it. The Nature Conservancy paid for a poll, I guess it was this summer, last summer, I believe, and this was the exact quote posed to the public and how many strongly agreed. And the quote is, even in difficult economic times, Alaska should still find money to protect and manage salmon habitats. 89% of the Alaska public agreed with that. That's astonishing. 89% of the Alaska public agreed with that. That would not happen in the lower 48. In the lower 48 states, the environment trumps the economy and no taxes for only 35% of the public. That's a real difference. Let's look at urbanization. I'll go through all these quickly. So one of the most significant trends of the last 100 years is that the world is increasingly living in cities. So over half the world now, the world lives in cities. In the US, 4 out of 5 American citizens live in cities. In Alaska, it's significantly lower. It's 2/3. 2/3 of Alaskans live in cities. But the trend's going up. You lag behind the rest of the country. It's interesting. I think you should pause. And it's interesting to ask. Alaska certainly did not start as an urban state. But if this trend of 60% in 1980, 67% now, what's it going to be in 2050? Be 80% urban? Pause and think about what that might mean to the conservation ethic. I don't know. It'll be interesting. This is where I'm sure Alaska has got to be unique, but I don't have kids here, but many of you out there must have kids in Alaska. There's a worry that our children are increasingly disconnected from nature. And there's a generational shift. When I grew up, I didn't grow up in a family that had any great, they weren't conservationists, they weren't really outdoorsmen, but we did a lot of stuff outdoors. And my whole generation did. Today's generation doesn't. And in fact, some sort of statistics that document it now is kids now know more corporate logos than they know animals. I'm not talking about scientific names. I'm talking about raccoon, squirrel, common names. They know more corporate logos. Even if there's a recent study, it's just sort of blew my mind. They did. There's a prize that is awarded to children's book. What is it? The Caldecott Prize? I might be getting it wrong. It's the best children's book every year. And they went back 60 years and looked at how children's books talk about nature and animals. There's been a steady decline in children's books in that. And look at this statistic. This is currently. For 15 to 70-year-old American kids, average 51 minutes per week in outdoor activities. 51 minutes per week. That's got to be different up here. I hope that it's got to be. Please tell me it is. But that affects things. I mean, that's not, what the kids are doing matters to the next generation's politics. So I'm assuming Alaska's different there. But here's how we were so concerned about this at Nature Conservancy that we went out and did focus groups and polls. I'm not going to show you the polls. The numbers are boring. I actually find the quotes more interesting. But the numbers reinforce this. Basically, we went to we were saying, how do we reach this next generation? We only went to cities. We went to cities with strong minority populations because whites will be the minority in the U.S. in another 20 or 30 years. Whites will be the minority. And so we went to Oakland, New York City, Miami. I'm forgetting the fourth city now. I've been San Antonio. And we did these focus groups, and this is how kids thought about conservation. You see the question. Imagine a person that cares about nature. Describe that person. We got a tree hugger here. She's a girl. She is white. She has money. Would you hang out with her? She's nice, but I'd not invite her to a party. She's uptight. And a word that came up a lot was preachy. Very, very preachy. So there's a certain self-righteousness about it. And these words, I mean, it's fascinating to read transcripts of focus groups. These are very different cities and see how it was perceived. That's not good. I don't think that would be the case up here. I don't know. None of these were done up here. It makes me want to collect some of this data up here. You've probably all heard of this thing called the Anthropocene. It's emphasizing the fact that humans have treaded so heavily on the planet that you can't go anywhere and not see our footprint. And that's true. You see the footprint up here in Alaska. You could see organic compounds in the fatty tissues of mammals up here. Obviously, climate change, which impacts Alaska, is a human footprint. And so there's even in Alaska, there's a heavy human footprint. But nonetheless, when you actually look at it, and my favorite way of looking at it, these night slides that NASA puts out, and you can see that nice dark spot, which is where Alaska is compared to the rest of the U.S. And you see this. There's a paper that's going to be coming out in Conservation, the journal Conservation Biology, shortly. It's a neat analysis. It asks where in the world are there still intact ecosystems? It defines intact in a special way. It means where there haven't been any major vertebrate extinctions in the last 200 years. And Alaska has 2 out of 17 of those. It'd have a lot more if you hadn't knocked off the muskox. But I mean, that's being reintroduced, but that's why the rest of Alaska isn't in this map. But still, those intact systems, vertebrate systems, are pretty precious. So a pristine system. But you have issues, environmental issues too. This is the one that I hear about in the lower 48 the most often, is the Pebble Mine. I don't know if it's what up here you care about the most, but it's the one that down there we hear about in the news the most, is the Pebble Mine. Let's step back and look at the Pebble Mine from a different perspective. I think we've got to shake ourselves up a little bit. And I got these slides from a friend of mine who's in a school called Industrial Ecology at Yale. So industrial ecology, think about the world like ecologists supposedly, but they engage with industries and the elements and substances that industries know. So he's talking about the Pebble Mine. And he points out this is, what it could produce. Big numbers, they don't mean anything. Let's look at it graphically. First, but the threats, you worry about what toxic metals and all the waste products can do to salmon, and salmon are important. I'll come back to it. Salmon are, why did that Alaska vote come out the way it did, where you'd spend money to protect habitats? Well, it came out partly because protecting habitats is protecting an industry. I think the figure is, I hope I get this right, it's one of my TNC colleagues sent me some analyses, but I believe it's totaling roughly $1 billion of income from salmon in this area. That includes commercial, recreational, and charter, and about 10% of the jobs. So it's not just salmon because you love nature, it's salmon because it's part of the economy and the vitality of the economy. But on the other hand, look what Pebble Mine could do to the U.S. in terms of its copper. More than double the U.S. copper. One mine, more than double the U.S. copper. Molybdenum, more than double that for the U.S. One mine. So here's what my friend from industrial ecology asked me. Is it moral to use materials for your own benefit? We use those. You have laptops, you have smartphones, you go to hospitals. That uses all those materials. It's not so easy when you think about it that way. Those materials are necessary materials for the life you live. And yet we have to make decisions about where we get them. It's a little less black and white. So let's say, is there another place in the United States, another state in the United States that matches Alaska? Low human footprint. By any measure, you have a very low human footprint. Vast natural systems, wilderness, that are largely intact. Strong outdoors and nature ethic. One of the things I did here before was I was on a National Academy to look at the issue about shooting wolves. And we had lots of town hall meetings where we met the public would have access to open mics to talk about how they felt about mooses and wolves and elk and all that. And it was just fascinating to me. I mean, a real ethic of hunting and self-sufficiency and so forth. Low population density. What's the population of Alaska? Is it under 1 million? I think it's that, yeah. But you also have energy and mineral resources. So I couldn't think of any state. There's no place in the U.S. that's like that. Here's my analog to you. It's a place I've been recently a couple times. It's one of my favorite places. Figure out where that is. You know where that is? This is a map. Another one of those maps of night lights, and that big black spot. Mongolia. Huge intact ecosystem. Low population density. Mongolia has 3 million people. It's the lowest population density of a nation. You're the lowest population density of a state. Guess what else they have? Mining. And we work with in Mongolia. Nature Conservancy works in there with mining. This is a map we put up. We work with a company called Rio Tinto. And this shows Rio Tinto's active mines, applications, and explorations. So the light blue is explorations, and the darker colors are active. That's Rio Tinto, one company. That's all the companies put together. Still not that much active mines, but an awful lot of exploration that could basically take this vast, intact country, spectacular, the world's best grasslands, low population density, a population that loves its nomadic herding lifestyle, does not want to give it up, a strong culture, and you have this tension. So what we do is we call it development by design. It's basically say, Mongolia, you're a poor country, you're a terribly poor country. Alaska's economy is doing much better than Mongolia's. Much, much better. But there's going to be mining. So what we want to do is, before all those light blue areas where you're exploring turn into mines, identify where you have to avoid because they're really special ecologically. If you go there, minimize it, any damage. If you do damage, restore it. And if you can't totally restore it, give some money to offset the damage so you could do good elsewhere. Not a bad scheme. It's a standard sort of scheme, but it's probably the way we have to go. Now, another way of thinking about this is what I would call conservation has been playing defense. It's been about protect, halt, stop, don't do this. And I think it's time to be proactive and be more visionary. Not about saving the past, about asking a question, what do you want Southeast Alaska? What do you want Alaska to look like in 2050? That's the question. And when you ask that question, it's about salmon, it's about jobs, it's about economic growth, it's about natural habitats, it's about recreation, culture, all of that. Local communities. It's a vision for all of those, but it's never just conservation. It can never just be a conservation exercise when you do the visioning. Never. And I got this slide from a TNC colleague as well that suggests to me that that is the way you're thinking about it. This is planning for the Prince Wales Island, where it's not obviously a place where you want to do conservation, but you can't pose it as a problem that's only conservation. You have to pose it as a problem as where there's going to be forestry, logging, and jobs and economics. It's got to be dual objectives. Well, we're about to have this September, I think it's the September, October, the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson. Extraordinary woman. Changed the world, a single individual, changed the world. And against all odds. You know, she's a scientist, but she couldn't get a university job because in those days women didn't get university jobs. So she went to work for the federal government, what became the Fish and Wildlife Service, as a writer. And of course she wrote Silent Spring. Sold out immediately. Went on CBS reports. Went on CBS reports and on television, drew record-breaking audience. Got criticized horribly. She was a spinster, not married. So all sorts of insidious innuendo about her gender proclivities. But you could trace to her the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. One of the things that she did that was powerful was, when you read her writings, is she connected conservation to people's everyday lives. She did it in two ways. She didn't talk about just wilderness out there or elephants in Africa or the spectacular tigers in the Himalayas. She painted a picture of a village and a backyard without birds. She brought it home. And then she quoted letters from housewives and farmers about what damage pesticide chemicals might be doing. Very personal stories connected it to what they saw. And it was effective. Anybody know what those numbers are? Any guesses what those numbers are? The last slide was a hint. So here's that slide. This is like you're taking a test and you haven't actually done the reading, but see if you can guess the answer. Congressional vote for the Endangered Species Act. So for the House of Representatives, 355 voted for the Endangered Species Act, only 4 against. In the Senate, it was 100-0. And we had Nixon as president. We've come a long way, haven't we, in terms of bipartisan conservation and politics. That's not good. That is not good. It can't be a partisan issue. How can conservation be a partisan issue? That's crazy, but that's what it is. And this was Rachel Carson's time. I'm going to end up with talking about a couple things, ideas about some of the new things we have to do. I opened the slide with these spectacular species you have in Alaska. There's a concept in ecology. Those of you who are ecologists know this concept well. It's Keystone Species. Species who, by their actions, they fundamentally shape the ecosystem or community that they're in. So if you got rid of those species, it would look very different. It would function very differently. And ecologists and resource managers know how to think about that. They know how to think about how to think about ocean management. They know how to think about grassland management in light of that. Well, what are keystone species globally? It's corporations. If you care about global ecology, the keystone species are corporations. They really are. I mean, don't forget all your political ideology. Just entities that shape the flow of energy and the structure of ecosystems. It's global corporations. Here's just some of my gee whiz numbers, but this drives it home. Walmart has a bigger GDP, its sales are bigger than the GDP of all but 25 countries. It's got over 2 million employees. It's got twice as many employees as Alaska has population. The world's largest investment manager has more money in assets than the national reserves of any country on the planet. Used to think about the World Health Organization as what dealt with world health. The Gates Foundation outspent them. That's the corporate private sector. I'm not being judgmental about it. I'm just saying I'm an ecologist. I seek a world that is sustainable, that has a vibrant natural community, and given that, these are the species I have to deal with. They are. And they're ready to deal. 80% of the Fortune 500 companies have serious sustainability efforts. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They need the social capital because they have to invest in many different countries. They need the social capital. In some cases, they have visionary leaders who really believe in it. And in other cases, they might need clean water. Coca-Cola, Pepsi depend on clean water. A lot of electronics and chemistry industry depends on clean water. They need cleaner water than we need to drink. So here's my hypothesis. This has got me in trouble because somehow I've been accused of sort of being a corporate shill for saying this. I don't come at it. I have no ideology about corporations or capitalism. And if anybody had been to my house, they'd see I hadn't been paid off. But here's how I think about it. And here's how the Nature Conservancy is beginning to think about it. If we can alter the business practices of corporations, we can do it in a way that advances conservation and work with market leaders. You can't do all corporations. You got to go into the mining sector and find the one mining company that might work with you. Go into the transportation sector, find the one transportation. Go into the energy sector, find the one oil company. It's not all of them, but you find the market leaders. And pro-environment practices need not interfere with business profits. That's my hypothesis. There's enough data that, I'm engaged in a research project to test that. I think that's a testable hypothesis. It's a testable hypothesis retroactively, and it's a testable hypothesis what we're doing. What I think is unfortunate about the conservation and environment movement, and maybe this, will make some of you feel squeamish because it's so cultural somehow in the environmental movement to have an enormous distrust of corporations. And, nobody gets up. No CEO of a corporation gets up in the morning and says, damn, I want to go and damage the environment this morning. They don't do that. They get up and say, I want to make as much money as I can make. That might be true. But they don't get up and say, I want to damage the environment. That's not their intent. So then you have to ask yourself, is there a way in that space for us to get conservation and environmental protection in alliance with business practices? You have to ask that. I'm not going to say it's easy, but you have to challenge yourself and do that. And I think if you look, churches do damage to the environment. Universities do damage to the environment. NGOs do damage to the environment. Individuals do damage to the environment. Institutions and people behave badly, and bad things happen. Mistakes are made. But that does not mean that just blanket, we have to write off corporations as the enemy. Because if we do, we're writing off the keystone species of the whole globe. And we have little chance of success. End up with one last point. Another reason, to think about that I've come to really think that conservation has sort of undersold itself because it hasn't been part of our discussion. I have two kids, and this is partly why it's made me think about it, is, we have 100,000 generations as hunter-gatherers where we're deeply connected to nature. I mean, you've all been out at night and had a sense of something, maybe felt a prickling on the back of your neck. What do you think that is? That's you as a prey. But it's a sense. And, you go back to prehistory and petroglyphs. We were very attentive to nature. The details of some of the cave paintings about natural history and species is astonishing. And we become disconnected from nature. Not in Alaska, but in much of the world. It has consequences. It has consequences, I think, increasingly for our happiness, our emotional, psychological, physical health. The science isn't there yet, but there are suggestions. I'll just show you one experiment. This is my favorite experiment. It's published a year ago. I don't know how many of you saw this. Anybody see this experiment done in Germany? Anybody know about this, the science geeks out there? This probably could only be done in Germany, but here's the experiment. It's a very cool experiment. They took young adults, this is at university, I think it was Heidelberg, who were from totally rural, and grew up in totally rural environments, from towns and then from cities. And they put them in a room and they gave them a math test. And as they were taking the test, they stressed them. They said, oh, it's wrong. Oh, your answer's wrong. You're going too slow. And they stressed them. And then they measured their stress. They did brain imaging to see what part of their brains were active. And they also did blood chemistry. And it turns out those that from the rural environment handled the stress much better. They weren't as stressed out. The part of their brains that reflects stress as opposed to cognition weren't activated. They were still able to focus and deal with the math problems and perform much better. A whole bunch of other tests like this. This was a pretty interesting experiment because it was at a common setting, the same experiment, different environments they lived in. But there's lots of other experiments about cognitive function, ability to focus, memory, and so forth, attention deficit disorder, that hints that some regular contact with nature is good for us. Good for us up here and here, I guess. We don't make that pitch. I think it's a really terrific line of research. And I know a couple of PhD students that are doing experiments on this now. It's very, very fascinating. Okay, another quiz. This is a top 5 list for states. So this is a top 5 in something. These are the states. What do you think it's for? Who said that? Happiness? You're right. So it's a Gallup poll. It's a poll, I don't know how good these indices are, but there's more and more attention to sort of asking people how happy they are. Those are the top 5 states for happiness. What else do they share in common, do you think, if you've been to them? Well, they have a strong outdoor ethic. There's an awful lot of outdoor activity in every one of those states. What else? Something to think about. So let me end up with 2 pieces of art. This is one of my favorite paintings by Picasso about the Spanish Civil War. It's a pretty vivid painting. This is, to me, the artistic rendition of how conservation too often has gone about its business. Litigation, suing, fighting, and so forth. And this is a famous painting by a Quaker minister from Pennsylvania. Hicks is his name. It's called Peaceable Kingdom. This is the way conservation needs to succeed in the future. Because if it does, I think we'll all be happier. Thanks, and I'll be happy to take questions. I'm afraid of what I said now. Jeez. What did I say? It was bad, Amanda.
Mike? Hello? We have a mic which we need to use for our streaming video, so I'll do some walk around. I saw Dominic Dewasawa's hand come up first.
Thanks. I'm Italian. I really don't need the mic. Peter, I enjoyed your talk. I worked with Reed Noss and a bunch of other scientists that have a paper coming out in Cons Bio called Thinking Bold for Conservation. And I think we would take exception to some of your points. But anyway, I want to kind of challenge you on a couple of them. You had one slide up there where you said anti-growth, anti-technology was somehow misanthropic. Mm-hmm. I could turn that around and say that it's actually in humanity's benefit that somebody stands up and says, stop, halt, don't. And I don't know anybody in the conservation community that just says it that way. We're always looking for alternatives. We're always looking to blend human needs with biophilia. And so I think you're kind of mischaracterizing it on some level, because if you flip that argument around and say pro-growth, pro-technology, pro-whatever, is somehow in favor of human development, I mean, we're wrecking the planet because we have runaway growth and runaway development. So if somebody doesn't say we need to put the brakes on this and look for an alternative, I mean, we're going to tank the system, basically.
Great. We disagree at a fundamental level, and that's good. And there's a couple ways of responding, and we're not going to resolve this tonight. One is it's simply the fact of that slide. I agree that conservation groups have tried to work with communities and have said we have to work with people. I agree with that, absolutely. My argument, but nonetheless, the public opinion and the protest, they've been able to be painted into a corner that that's not the case. And the reason is, I think, is because when we work with communities, it's to advance our goals, our conservation goals. I'm saying when we work with communities, it has to be to also advance their goals. And if their goals, if Mongolia needs economic growth, and they want it, they want economic growth. And so we have to go into them and say, guess what? We're for your economic growth, Mongolia. We're for you having mining for that economic growth, but we also want you to be for conservation. So it's yes, we work with communities, but we work with them, I think, to advance our goals. I think we have to work with them to advance their goals with equal vigor. And that's a fundamental difference. So when I want to do a conservation plan in a country, I would not want to just plan for biodiversity. I'd want to plan for the energy they needed as well. And then a second place where we you know, I certainly agree with this stop. That was that slide I showed of that mitigation hierarchy that has a slide that says avoid. But you can't say avoid unless you say at the same time, but here's places where you can do it. You have to do the same thing at once. Avoid here, go here for your activity. And I disagree with this underlying mantra that growth is some sort of blight. I don't think growth is bad. I think the population is going to level off. It already is starting to level off. The trick is to get through the next 30 years where we're going to add 3 billion people. Then it's leveling off. Many countries are already declining in population. And then it's about quality of life. But I am for growth. I'm for economic growth. Oh, well. Go ahead.
Hi, Dan Fiorucci, Channel 2, Anchorage, over here to your left. I was just wondering, you spoke a little bit about Pebble Mine and the threat to the salmon. I think the greatest salmon runs in Alaska are actually here. And could you speak a little bit about the Tongass, apparently before environmental regulation, was very heavily logged. And could you speak about the importance of restoring that watershed to, protecting the salmon runs here?
So I don't know the data for the Tongass. I used to work for NOAA in salmon conservation, in the Snake and Columbia River. So I imagine salmon are a wonderful species in the sense that at one level, they have a really high reproductive rate, and their populations can grow very rapidly and be hugely productive. So they're almost like a weedy species in terms of how fast their populations can grow. On the flip side, there's all sorts of aspects of water quality that have a negative impact on them. So sedimentation has a negative impact, water temperature, chemicals, pesticides, all those things can impair salmon. I don't know what the data are from the Tongass, but the interesting thing of that duality is that they're very sensitive, but if you provide them with a good environment, they can recover rapidly and do very well. So there's both good news and bad news. And I think that's sort of fundamental to salmon ecology, and that dual thinking should probably be part of, whatever plans you are. But I'm sorry, I do not know the Tongass data.
My name is Rick Turner. And I was just curious, as an ecologist, in your statement about the need to work with corporations and communities and such to encourage growth along with conservation, how that can be reconciled with the global economic model, which is basically built on not only continuous and infinite growth, but exponential growth in an essentially finite system. It seems to me that by promoting that model, you're simply delaying the inevitable. That it's kind of like polishing the brass on the Titanic. When the force of growth is actually deteriorating the systems, you can do something, but it's not enough. But I was just curious, is how do you deal with that kind of conundrum, or do you think that's a conundrum in your model?
Yeah, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but you characterize this global economic model of sort of runaway continuous growth and that inevitably being damaging. I don't characterize it so simplistically as that. I sort of see it differently. You know, there's no question, as an example, that as countries develop wealth, they care more about their environment. No question about that. And that it's the wealthier countries that then have the most advanced pollution control and sort of environmental, but that's sort of an empirical fact. The other thing is that growth can happen. You know, there's a number of companies that are having huge market growths, in a sense, by marketing sustainability. What perhaps the best thing is certified fisheries. Certified fisheries wasn't even around in 2000. I can't remember. I think it started maybe in 2006. I may have the numbers wrong, but it started maybe 10 years ago, certified fisheries, labeled fisheries. It started with a very tiny part of the market, no market. And then in 5 or 6 years, it went from 1% of the fish sold were certified to 12% are certified. That's huge market growth. That is economic growth linked to sustainable fishery. So consumers have some decisions. So I would be all for labeling, consumer behavior, and those things have the potential to shape the economic system to go towards a future we want. Now, it's true if consumers make choices that have no regard for what happens in the environment, then you may well get the damage, you know, and you say. But it's not because profit is based on it. There's an awful lot of consumer choice involved. I don't see it, you know, I don't actually, you're not an economist, I'm not an economist, but I find that caricature, which is something environmentalists often fall into, just exactly like you say that. If you mention that to somebody who was a serious businessman who really cared about the environment, and there's many of them, they would say how naive and how simplistic. That's really not how the world works. And it's my impression it doesn't work that way either. It's not a matter of growth inevitably leading to environmental destruction. If the population were to continue growing exponentially, that would be the case. But the population is not going to continue to grow exponentially. Not. It's when women get jobs and move to cities, they cut their fertility rates just like that almost instantly. And that's happened around the world. So the population is going to level off, and it'll be about finding an economic system that focuses on quality of life, of which the environment is part of the quality of life. But it will not be about an economic system that isn't based upon, you know, profit and some growth for companies. But actually, I mean, we have a fundamental disagreement about economics here. Neither of us are economists, so.
Hi, I'm Karen. I had a question about the 15 through 17-year-olds. You said you were outside for 51 minutes every week, but most of the time those kids were probably in school, right? So technically they're not going outside because they're in school. So should schools like UAS, who has an outdoor studies program, should high schools and whatnot start having outdoor studies classes? And if so, are people going to fund it? So that's my question.
So the question is essentially, don't schools have something to do with this? And of course, you know, we have a program called the LEAF program. So you could go on the web and look up LEAF, the Nature Conservancy. And it's a program where we take urban kids and they actually work on our sites, usually helping scientists. And it's transformative. It's amazing what happens to those kids. It's inspiring. It costs money, so we had to get Toyota to pay for it. And they gave us several $1 million to pay for it. It's a sad reality that schools' budgets are cut, and a lot of those outdoor programs are more expensive than just keeping kids in the classroom, so they're often, at least in the lower 48, the first to get cut. But I actually do believe that outdoor education, some sort of contact, is important. We've got to find a way to do it and maybe do it cheaply.
A warm thank you to Dr. Peter Kareiva. Thank you very much.